So just a bit of historical, cultural background to the setting of when this book is written. The Jews of the first century had a very high view of angels. Angels featured a lot in their thinking, in their theology, in their understanding of the world, and particularly from about 200 BC. In that time between the Testaments, angels became increasingly prominent in Jewish thinking. So a number of the intertestamental writings that are not part of the Bible but were written in that period say a lot about angels. So by the first century, the Jews had adopted a lot of thinking about angels. So both the Hebrew word in the Old Testament and the Greek word in the New Testament literally mean a messenger or an emissary, one who is sent to give a message. And often, but not always, angels, but 99% of the time in the Bible, angels come to communicate a message from God to people. We might say, well, why did God use angels? Well, our creatureliness means we have limited capacity. How can a creature comprehend God, the Creator? But also our sinfulness means that we are unworthy to come fully into God's presence. So God uses angels as, in a sense, intermediaries. You could say that the use of angels as messengers is to enable the reception of God's word and make it accessible, to present it in a way that we as human beings can actually hear it and comprehend it. Exodus 33:20 says, when God is speaking to Moses, he says, "No one may see my face and live." So he's making a statement about human beings can't come directly into God's presence and hear God communicate. So God uses angels to make that message more accessible from our perspective. Here's a quick quiz. Does anyone know the first time that an angel is mentioned in the Bible, or we see an angel doing something in the Bible?
When Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden.
A cherubim?
That's a different one, isn't it?
That's cherubim, yeah. So that's a different kind of being to an angel.
But the popular idea of angels has probably picked up the creatures with wings, hasn't it?
That's right, yeah. So the cherubim are described as having wings because they were kind of portrayed as these composite creatures, maybe of several animals combined, like with a dragon's or a lion's head and body, and then wings like an eagle. That was a cherub. And then people have assumed cherubs are angels, and so that's why in artwork angels are given wings, when actually angels are never described as having wings in the Bible. The first time an angel appears in the Bible is in Genesis 16 with Hagar, if you know the story. So the first angel appears to someone who's not even an Israelite. She's an Egyptian slave who's been banished, and she's out in the wilderness, and an angel of the Lord comes to her and brings her a message of comfort and protection and promise, which is interesting. The other thing that angels do is they highlight the significance of God's communication. So when in the Bible you see an angel coming to a person, it's often at a time of strategic importance. Like that person, they have to have their attention grabbed by the appearance of a being, rather than just maybe hearing a voice in their head or something. It kind of grabs them and as if to say something important is about to happen, you need to listen. For example, Moses, we tend to think Moses out in the wilderness saw a burning bush. He did, but it actually says the angel of the Lord came to Moses in the burning bush. So it wasn't just a burning bush, it was actually an angel appearing to Moses that grabbed his attention. The other thing an angel does is it still indicates the not too distant, not too far away presence of the Lord. So people still are full of fear when they see an angel, and they often fall down. They're even tempted to worship the angel. And sometimes in the angelic encounters in the Bible, feels like there's a bit of a blurring between, is it the angel speaking or God himself speaking? So there's these instances of Abraham and Moses and John where the presence of the angel is so overpowering that it's as if they're actually communicating with God, and that's kind of the point. It is God communicating with us through the angel. So you can kind of see then by the time of the first century, with all that biblical idea of angels, plus all of the stuff that had come in from other sources in the centuries before, that the Jews had a very high view of angels. So they saw them as intermediaries, as mediators between human beings as God, or even as primary mediators, right? The only way to connect with God, they thought, would be through an angel. They even gave them a priestly status, to the point where some even said that the angels would make offerings to atone for our sins, like the priests in the temple. And some even worshipped angels, prayed to angels, almost as if they were divine beings or gods. So most likely the writer of Hebrews is responding to this kind of idea in first century Judaism that some Christians have maybe taken on board, or because they're Jews who've become Christians, they've taken these very high ideas of angels. And you can understand how some might even be saying, well, maybe Jesus was an angel, because they almost would have seen angels as being so high up that if Jesus was able to do miracles and so on, then maybe he was an angelic being himself. Now, how do we see angels in the Gospels? Well, we see the angels in the conception and birth stories of Jesus' birth. There's angels coming to Mary and to Joseph, appearing to the shepherds and so on. When's the next time angels appear? Can anyone remember?
Jesus' baptism, it says, after he went out into the desert, angels helped him.
Yes, so during his temptation, straight after his baptism, being tempted by the devil, and then when the temptation was over, it says angels came to strengthen him, ministered to him. Yeah. When's the next time? The next time we see an angel appear in all the Gospels is when Jesus is in Gethsemane, praying, saying, Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering from me. And that says an angel came and strengthened him. So it's kind of like a bit of a bookend. His temptation at the start of his ministry, and then his suffering that started in Gethsemane at the end of his ministry. And then, of course, we see angels announcing his resurrection. They're at the tomb when the women come and the tomb is empty and so on. So it's interesting to note that there's actually an absence of angelic activity through the time of Jesus' public ministry. Between his temptation and his suffering and death, we don't see angels. Which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you think if Jesus, as we'll see in a moment, if Jesus is the means by which God is speaking to humanity, if he is the message of God embodied, then there's no need for angels during that time, because God is speaking clearly through his Son, as it says there in verse 1. So let's work our way through this chapter. to see what it has to say to us about Jesus. And the first thing we'll see in the first four verses are really key interpretive principles that will give us a basis for understanding the rest of the book. The first principle we see by his use of long ago, verse 1, and then verse 2, but in these last days. So long ago, and then in other words, in these days we're in now, in these last days. So that's the idea of what we might call biblical theology. The idea that there is promise and fulfillment. Old Testament, New Testament. So we'll see words like promise, shadow, incomplete, old, shakeable, servant, elementary, weak, referring to the long ago in the past, and then that is fulfilled, and we'll see words like fulfillment, substance, complete, new, permanent, unshakable, son, mature, noble. So really that is it's the first basic principle really for reading the Bible. It's the first thing we need to understand if we pick up the Bible for the very first time, to understand this principle that the Bible has Old Testament, New Testament, promise, fulfillment, shadow, reality. So we should always be asking, whatever we're reading, is this before Jesus, therefore it's pointing forward to Jesus, or is what I'm reading later in the Bible, in the New Testament, is it after Jesus, so in some ways explaining how Jesus is the fulfillment of the old? And the book of Hebrews brings that out quite clearly, because as we saw last week, it's punctuated by quotes from the Old Testament, and then he explains what those Old Testament passages mean for us today as we see how Jesus has fulfilled them. The problems that will arise from not recognising this principle of long ago and now in these last days might be that Christians adopt Old Testament patterns and rules that are no longer relevant to us or have been made obsolete. So we might go to the Old Testament and read instructions about what we must do, and we say, oh, the Bible tells me I shouldn't trim the sides of my beard, so I better not trim the sides of my beard, which I haven't done, which is, But then I need to understand, well, no, actually that was written for Old Testament Israel in a certain time and context, and is no longer applicable to me today as a Christian now that Jesus has fulfilled the old.
He didn't trim his.
Sorry?
He didn't trim his beard.
Well, we don't know. We don't know if he didn't. He doesn't say, but anyway. The other misunderstanding that can come is sometimes Christianity is critiqued. People might say, well, why do you Christians insist on this particular moral standard of sexuality that is in the Old Testament, but you ignore the passages after it that say don't eat shellfish and don't eat clothes of don't wear clothes of mixed fibre? That comes from a misunderstanding again of how the old has been fulfilled by Jesus in the new. So we'll see that principle coming through again and again in the book of Hebrews. The next principle is God spoke and has spoken. So this idea of God speaking. It's a fundamental attribute of God's relationship to us, his creatures, is that he communicates. He's the God who speaks. And hence we have a book which we call his word, because he's spoken and is speaking to us. In fact, you could say communication is actually in God's nature. It is God's nature to be a God who communicates and speaks. And he speaks in such a way that we we have moral accountability. To be in God's image means we hear God speak to us, and that means we are morally accountable to him because he tells us what it means to be human, how we should live, and so on. And so we have a responsibility to hear him and to obey him. So Christianity is a revealed faith, not a philosophical one. So some religions, philosophies say we find out about God by kind of working it out ourselves or by meditating or seeking enlightenment. Christianity says, no, you know who God is because God has spoken, he's revealed himself to us and made himself known. So Judaism is the same. Judaism, the Jews believe that they know who God is because they have the Old Testament as their scriptures. So Christianity is built on that principle. And then Islam, we would also call a revealed faith, but that's because they would claim that their religion is based on the previous revelations of God. Okay, we better keep moving. Just realised the time. The third principle is the identity or the nature of the Son, through whom God has spoken. Just get my... Now, notice in verse... Find it here. Verse 2, so in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Actually in the Greek it's just Son, so he's spoken to us by a Son. So he's not necessarily emphasising the individual person, he's emphasising the title. So in the past he's spoken through prophets, but now he's spoken through one who is a son, and he's drawing that distinction between the role of a prophet and the role of the son. And he says that the Son is the means of God speaking. Jesus didn't just come with a message to bring like an angel would, but John 1:1. Anyone know what John 1:1 says? In the beginning was the Word. So he's called the Word. Yeah. And then John 1:14 says, and the Word became flesh. So Jesus is the enfleshed, embodied message of God. Jesus is the Word from God. He is the message from God. He's the one who makes God known. So what we can see here is he makes a series of statements about who Jesus is. And whether or not you believe these things about Jesus, we need to understand that this is the understanding of Christians of who this person Jesus is. And you need to know that in order to understand what the New Testament says about him. Right, if that makes sense. So this is the assumption. And I think the author of Hebrews is making the assumption, rightly, that the people he's writing to, they know the other parts of the New Testament. They know the Gospels and what Christians have been saying and teaching already about Jesus. But he's making these points to distinguish Jesus from the prophets in the past, but also to make it very clear Jesus isn't just an angel. Jesus is something altogether different. He is the Son. So, his nature is God the Son. It says that he is appointed as an heir, as the heir of all things. That means he has the right of ownership because of his status as the Son. The Son inherits from the Father. So it's saying that the universe was created with the express purpose of being a gift to the Son from God the Father. Secondly, it says, through whom also he created the world. So through whom God created all things, which tells us that Jesus was prior to creation. He's not included in all of the created things. So that he's saying he's not a created being, he was actually there already, and then through him all things. He's not included in the all things. That's why we say in the Nicene Creed about Jesus, he was begotten, not made, not created. Then he talks about his relationship to God the Father as the Son. So the first thing he says is, he is the radiance of God's glory. We could say the outward expression of God's eternal power and divine nature. And then the second thing he says is that he is the exact imprint of his nature, of his character. The actual Greek word there is character, or substance. One way to understand these two concepts is, if you think of the sun has its nature, its substance, what makes up the sun in its, whatever it is, hydrogen, gas or whatever, and fire, all that stuff. But then the sun radiates that light and that heat and that energy, and we could say that's the sun's glory. It's what we actually see, what reaches us is the sun's light and so on. And that's kind of these two ideas of God's glory is the external outshining of what he is, and then there's his substance, his nature, which is really the essence of who he is. Romans 1:17 talks about something of God's glory being made known in creation. It's like God's fingerprints over everything that he's made. So people can see his divine power and his divinity, that the fact that there is a God who must have made all of this, but only his inner life or his character, his nature, can be made known by the Son himself. So John 1:18, so see how he's assuming that people know the Gospel of John, because he's really bringing out these same truths. John 1:18 says, "No one has ever seen God. The only God who was at the Father's side, he has made him known." So that's the idea of this person, the Son, makes us know not just the external attributes of God, but actually who God really is in his essence. He then goes on to talk about his actions as the Son. So the first thing is he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So everything in the universe is sustained and maintained and is kept going by the word of his power. That must mean he can't just be a human being. He can't even just be an angel. That is a function that God alone would have as the creator. So he's saying this Son, Jesus the Son, has divine power to create and to maintain the whole universe. Now what he does in these three statements about what he does as the Son is he actually brings out the threefold ministry of Jesus. So if he upholds the universe by the word of his power, what kind of ministry does that make you think of? Who is it who speaks a word? We saw it back in verse 1, didn't we?
Oh, the prophet, priest, king, prophet.
Yeah, so God spoke, and that's the idea of the prophetic ministry of Jesus. His word that he speaks isn't just a message from God. His word actually has power to hold the whole universe together. Secondly, we're told that he made purification for sins. Now, what kind of ministry is that? That's a priestly ministry. A priest deals with human sin and makes purification. A priest is chiefly concerned with the reconciliation between God and human beings. So they make sure that the justice of God is satisfied, and they make sure that sinful human beings are forgiven in order for us to be reconciled. That's the role of a priest, purification for sins. And then the third thing is he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. What kind of ministry is that? Kingly, yes. If you're at the right hand of the Majesty, then you're the right-hand man of the King. So Jesus establishes the kingdom of God, the reign of God, in which God is rightly honoured and glorified for who he is as the creator and ruler of all things, but also that human beings are then, within that rule, are free then to worship and obey joyfully, to have peace and security, to live as we were designed to be as human beings. Okay, now, so he's made these quite bold statements about who this person is, who Jesus is. But, as he said, God has spoken in the past through the prophets. So let's go back and let's see what the prophets have said in the past. So now he quotes a whole series of Old Testament passages and shows how that actually confirms and affirms these statements that he's just made about Jesus. So the first kind of key argument he puts forward is that Jesus is supreme, even over angels. And then we see that in verses 5 to 7. So we're just going to very quickly go through each of these Old Testament references and see what they have to say to us. So the first one he quotes is, "For which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'?" Now that's from Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is the second most quoted psalm in the New Testament after Psalm 110, which we'll come to later. It's a coronation psalm. So it's a psalm that probably was written for or was read at the coronation of a king. And in fact, we're told in other places that it was actually a psalm of David. So it was most likely written for and read out at the coronation of King David. Now, in the Old Testament times, kings were called sons of God. There was a title that was given, not just to Hebrew kings, but even pagan kings were given that kind of title, son of God or son of the gods, in a figurative sense because they were seen to be representatives of God. They were ruling with God's authority. But note that the promise and the mandate that's given to David in Psalm 2 is way beyond what David could ever accomplish or actually ever knew in his lifetime. "I will give the nations and the ends of the earth as your inheritance." Well, David only ever ruled just over Israel. It talks about kings of the earth coming and bowing down and giving allegiance to this king. Some did, but we know, again, not all the kings of the earth came and gave their allegiance to David. So it's actually, while it was kind of superlative language used for the coronation of David, there was this sense of, but we know that this merely human king isn't actually going to be able to achieve all of those ideals. There needs to be another king yet to come who is even greater than David, who will be able to command all the kings of the earth. Now, the point here is not necessarily yet Jesus' divinity, but his superior position. The idea that he is King of Kings. And this is a kind of title, kind of language that's never used in the Bible of angels. So that's kind of his point. To which of the angels? He hasn't called any of the angels my son and given them this kind of mandate. So, Psalm 2 shows us a king who has absolute authority, is the argument there. The second quotation comes from 2 Samuel 7 verse 14. I'll kind of relying on you to quickly look these up if you don't know them. Now in this passage, God is giving a promise to David. So David is now the king. God is giving a promise to David that one of his sons would establish the kingdom forever and will sit on the throne forever. David wanted to build a temple for God, and God says, don't worry about building the temple for me. I'm going to build a house for you, and it'll be done through your son. So it's a promise showing that David wasn't the one who would fulfill Psalm 2. It would be his son or his descendant who would be the one to whom all the kings of the earth would submit. Now, we know that promise was partly fulfilled in Solomon, because Solomon was the one, David's son Solomon was the one who built the temple in Jerusalem. But as we'll see, the temple built by Solomon was just a shadow pointing forward. 14b, that's verse 14b of Psalm 2, talks about when he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, which is actually pointing forward to the cross. So this descendant of David, this great king, would not only be a great king to the ends of the earth, but he would also be the suffering servant that we see in Isaiah 52 and 53. He would be a king who would be punished, actually, and we see in Jesus, not for his own sin, but he's punished for the sins of others on their behalf. Psalm 89 verse 26 is also another reference that the writer's probably thinking of there, but we'll skip ahead because of the time. So 2 Samuel 7 talks about this promised descendant of David that would come. Okay, the next quotation, let God's angels worship him, comes from Deuteronomy 32 verse 43, and it's also referenced in Psalm 97 verse 7. Okay, now in that psalm, the Hebrew word for God is Elohim. So what it actually says in that psalm is let all gods worship him, and the word is Elohim. We say, well, hang on, that's not what he's written here. He's got let all God's angels worship him. But that word Elohim is used to refer to God. It's used to refer to gods. But also, because of its literal meaning, is sometimes used to refer to great ones. Great people are sometimes called Elohim. And angels are sometimes described as Elohim. So the writer of Hebrews is picking up on that. And so in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it actually says, as he's got it here, let all God's angels worship him. So the translators of the Greek Old Testament have added in that word angels to make it clear that they understood that this use of the word Elohim is actually referring to angels, calling angels to worship to worship God, basically. Hope that makes sense. But I think what the writer is doing is he's assuming that people reading this, they know the gospel stories. They know that when Jesus was born, so when he brings the firstborn into the world, reference to Jesus' birth, what happened? The whole heavens burst forth, the shepherds were there, and the sky was filled with a multitude of angels singing glory to God in the highest and peace on earth. So Jesus comes into the world, the Son comes into the world, is born as a baby, and all of the angels burst out in worship. So what he's saying from Deuteronomy 32 is that this Son, this person Jesus, is worshipped by angels. That Old Testament reference is referring to Jesus in that way. The next quotation comes from Psalm 104, verse 4. Of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The sceptre of uprightness is the sceptre of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." Is that the right reference? Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Verse 7, of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. Sorry about that. Now, in the NIV, it shows that this line could also be translated differently. It could be translated as he makes winds his messengers. Remember that word messenger is the same as the word for angel. Flames of fire his servants. And I think what he's emphasising here is God uses even impersonal forces of nature to get his message across. He uses wind and he uses fire to communicate in some way. And so he's emphasising here this utilitarian nature of angels. Angels have been created in order to perform a function. That's all they are, really. They don't have this high status. So what he's arguing here from Psalm 104 is angels are merely messengers. That's all they are. So don't pray to them, don't worship them, don't lift them up as if they're something special that you need to honour. They're simply creatures made by God in order to serve his purpose of getting his message to people. Okay, the next point he makes then is, so he's established Jesus is supreme and angels cannot even compare to his greatness. In fact, he's spoken of as one with absolute authority and power and rule. But his supremacy is because of his divinity. So the next few quotations actually point to Jesus' status, not just as a king, but his status actually as divine, as God. So the first one is Psalm 45, 6-7, which I read out just before. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The sceptre of uprightness is the sceptre of your kingdom. Now, what's interesting about that is Psalm 45 it's actually entitled a love song. And when you read it, you see it's actually a psalm that was written for the wedding, the marriage of a king. So it talks about the king, firstly, and then it goes on to talk about the queen who was by his side. So it was written for a royal wedding, basically. So he's speaking to this king, but he's calling him God. Your throne, O God, is forever. And we might say, oh yeah, but maybe he's using it symbolically, as he did when he said, you are my son, today I've become your father. But see how it goes on in verse 9 to say, therefore God, your God, has appointed you with the oil of gladness. So the context demands that we understand that use of the word God to mean the same. So you are God, yet God, who is your God, has appointed you with the oil of gladness. I kind of wonder how the Jews read that and thought, hang on, how can, this doesn't fit our theology that this is just a mere man. They must have been really not sure what it meant. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, well, here's what it means. It's speaking of this Son who is a king, who is also divine, who can be spoken of in the same way that we speak of God himself. So God, your God, and then your throne is forever and ever. Again, a kind of something that can only be ascribed to God himself. So Psalm 45 tells us that there is this king who is called God, who has an everlasting throne, speaking of this person, the Son. Right, the next one he quotes is Psalm 102, 25 to 27. You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. Now, when we look at that actual psalm, we see it's not even a psalm about a king, either being coronated or being married. It's simply a psalm that is written directly to God. It's a worship psalm praising God. It's not explicitly messianic. So we might say, well, why is he picked this one? Why is he quoting this psalm to affirm that Jesus is not just human, but is actually God? Well, it's because he sees the connection with Psalm 45. What is it that this psalm has in common with the quote from Psalm 45? We'll see how in verse 8, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So this idea of being the king forever and ever. And then verse 10 and 11, you laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment, but you are the same. Your years will have no end. So he's bringing those two similarities together from Psalm 45 and Psalm 102. And what he's really saying there is, well, if Psalm 45 speaks of Jesus as God, speaks of this promised king as God, then that means all the other passages, such as Psalm 102, can also be applied to Jesus. Because we've already seen we can speak of this Jesus of the Son in terms that we would only speak of God. So therefore, this psalm applies to Jesus. So Psalm 102 is saying that Jesus is able to be spoken of as we speak of God himself. All right, we're nearly there. The last one that he quotes is Psalm 110, which, remember, as I said, is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament, and it's actually the most quoted psalm in the book of Hebrews. We'll actually see this psalm come up a number of times in the book. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Now, you might actually have to look up Psalm 110 to see what he says just before that. Because what the psalm actually says is, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And if you look at verse 1 of Psalm 110, you'll see that Lord is spelt in two different ways. The first, the Lord, is in capitals, and that's an indication that it is Yahweh, the divine name, the name of God, that Jews knew God by. And then the second use of Lord is in small lowercase, which means it's the Hebrew word Adonai, which just means Lord or Master or King or Ruler. and could be used of a human being who's in authority. But it was also because the Jews didn't actually want to use God's name in case they used it wrongly and got punished by God. Whenever they came across the word Yahweh in the scriptures, they would instead say Adonai, Lord. So it's the most common way that Jews referred to God himself, by saying Lord, Adonai. So David is saying that he has a Lord who is higher than him, but then this Lord is sitting at the right hand of the Lord, of God himself. So David says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Basically saying, my Lord is of equal position, authority, power as the Lord, as Yahweh, as God himself. John 1:1. Remember what John 1:1 says? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's exactly that same idea, isn't it? With God, so more than one person, but one divine nature. So this Lord of David's is actually divine in nature. Notice verse 4 of Psalm 110 talks about this priestly kingly role, which will come out later in the book. So Psalm 110 tells us that this Son, that Jesus, is David's divine Lord. So we start off with that promise that one of David's descendants, one of his sons, would be this great king. And we've come to the end where we actually see that David is acknowledging this Lord actually as his king.